see, air conditioning is a bit loud. He's a historian, but a very, very special sort of historian. And as we were walking here, we were just discussing how if he worked at a university, he'd have to attend school board meetings and senate meetings and publish in the right journals. But he's taken a different route, and he's, can I call you a populist historian? I don't know. An oral historian. But I don't think there's anybody who knows more about Hong Kong than Jason Modi. He does books and historical books. Every single one is very well subscribed, and people are very, very interested in it. He goes to Macau, to Guangdong province, to Guangzhou. He goes to Shantung Po, Stanley, up in the hills looking at the Japanese border fences and so on. So he's very much a hands-on historian, and he's a wonderful speaker. And today he's going to talk about Hong Kong in the 1950s, which, if you looked at this place in the 1950s, you'd have seen, I think, nothing. Nothing that's here now, on our campus, certainly. We had one building over on the other old campus. And so in just 50, 60 years, our Hong Kong has changed a lot. So I think this is going to be a really interesting talk. And I'd like you all to give a hand to Jason Modi, please.
Well, thank you very much, Judith, for that very kind introduction. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit down, at least in part, because I've been doing part of what I do in the course of my working life, and that is walking this morning. I took a walk out around the Western District, so I've had 4 hours of dalai and finally managed to get here in the right time, so I'm late. So my apologies for that. Does my voice carry? You can hear okay? Good. All right. Hong Kong in transformation, life in the 1950s. What I'm going to talk about in the course of the next 45 minutes or so is how Hong Kong as a society changed and transformed very greatly in the 1950s, because certain places and certain periods one can see historically as times of liftoff. And indeed, we've got liftoff there with someone trying to do something. How do we go away, die? Hey, right. Yes, transformation and change. This is transforming and changing, and we don't want it to change and transform around me. Certain places and certain societies tend to have points in their history and evolution where things radically shift and radically alter. And Hong Kong in the 1950s was one of those times and one of those places. And the foundation of the society and the culture which we have around us today, in many respects, goes back to that time. So what I'm going to process and go through in the course of the next 45 minutes or so, if this ever works, go away. Why is that? I don't know. Shouldn't be happening. Is how this society changed and evolved. Now, to understand how Hong Kong came through in the 1950s, we need to have some understanding of what Hong Kong was like before the time which transformed, or the time of transformation. What was Hong Kong like if we were to go back into notionally the late 1940s? What was the population? What was the general industry and background? If we went back to the end of the Sino-Japanese War, or the Pacific War, depending on which label you wish to use, that is to say the end of the conflict involving Japan, China and the Western powers, we can say 1945 is a reasonable date. What was Hong Kong like? The population at the end of the war was just under 500,000 people, 500,000. The pre-war average total was a little bit over 1 million, which between 1938 and the Japanese invasion of China, Japanese invasion of Hong Kong in 1941, increased to a bit over 2 million. So the population pre-war was averaging about 1 million. It had dropped to about 500,000. Jesus. It had dropped to about 500,000 at the end of the Pacific War and came back to about 1 million people. So 1 million people is not a very large society when one considers that Hong Kong today has how many people? 7 million. So it was a seventh of the population as we have today. the major economic activity in 1946, as covered in the annual reports of the time, was fisheries. The fisheries in 1946 were the single largest economic activity. Hong Kong today has effectively dead fisheries. We've now got a trawling ban you may be aware of, so there aren't any fisheries in that sense. Other industries, a common misapprehension is that there was no industry in Hong Kong at that time. That's completely inaccurate. Never let anyone tell you that Hong Kong was just a little fishing port until the Shanghainese came and opened up the textile mills and suddenly industrial economy. That's not the case. There was a significant amount of industry, shipbuilding, ship repairing, sugar refining, tobacco processing, some cotton milling. There was quite a bit. And actually the interesting thing with industry at the point in time before the 1950s it was mostly Cantonese capital. The Shanghainese money came in the late 1940s. It was mostly Cantonese money that was invested here before the early 1950s. So it wasn't a very big town. Hong Kong, 1945-46, had about, as I said, 1 million people. By the early 1950s, that had grown to nearly 2.5 million. Here we have a view looking down over the central business district and out toward Causeway Bay and Wan Chai. You can actually date this photograph from the buildings. And this is where photographs are very interesting, if we actually see them as historical documents. Because you can see a photograph as simply an image of an earlier time, or you can see it as a document. Now, if we were to look at this, you can date it, because there you've got the old Hong Kong Bank, next to it, China Bank. The China Bank was finished in 1950. So the thing with using an older photograph as a document, you can generally take a building as a reference point. And I use that because if you're doing journalism and you're doing photographs properly, you need to get your facts right. It's a thing which historians these days, people, particularly those overly influenced by postmodernism, usually don't do, and that is worry too much about facts. A basic fact is the underpinning of your trade. So find out what the fact is. And with a photograph, it's quite easy. If you're not sure of the building, find out where the building was, and then go and find out when it was built. From that, you can get some dating in your picture. It's quite easy to do. But I'm going away from Hong Kong and on to journalistic practice. So the early 1950s, that was what the city looked like, a vague recollection of what we can find today. But it was starting to change. And the reasons it was starting to change was a massive influx of population. There's another view. This is closer up. This is in Queen's Road in Central. Now, if you're down in Central today, it's a bit different to now. The buildings which you had, really up until the early 50s, were typically 3-storied or 4, and Hong Kong then was not very different to parts of Guangzhou today. If you want to know what Hong Kong looked like in the 50s, you need to go up to Guangzhou. There wasn't much difference between the two. And of course it makes sense because that was where the culture came from and that's where most of the people came from. That was the principal influence. But I wanted to mention it because we look at that today and you think another world, another time, completely different, and it's only by occasional little fragments you can tell what was there. But what caused this major change? Always in Hong Kong, the causes of change are external. Comes from somewhere else. And the main external change and transformation which led on to Hong Kong as we see it today was the Chinese Civil War. Now the Chinese Civil War has a number of periods which we can date it to. The nationalist-communist conflict really starts back in the 1920s with the split in the Nationalist Party there, with the Russian advisors and their involvement. You can see it as that. You can also see it in the 1930s with the Long March and Chiang Kai-shek's crushing down on the communists and their movement. You can also see the United Front, which was brought about between the nationalists and the communists in 1936. But the real impact in Hong Kong came from 1946. Because what happened then, or after then, is the nationalists and communists went into open conflict with each other on the mainland, and anyone who had any eye to see what was going on knew that Chiang Kai-shek's people would eventually fail. It was obvious to anyone with an eye to see by 1946. It was more and more obvious by 47. By 1948, anyone but a blind person could see it. And there are a number of reasons for that. At least in part is that the communists had been given a breathing space by the Japanese. The thing that they don't like to be reminded of today is, of course, by about 1935, 1936, they were basically squashed. Keep another year or two going and they would have been finished. So it's an interesting bit there. The Marshal of Manchuria gave them their breathing space when he kidnapped Chiang in 1936. The Japanese assisted that. Of course, by the end of the war, the country was exhausted and worn out, and the nationalists themselves were completely corrupt. And if you've got a government which is hopelessly corrupt, eventually they will fall. They must. They will. And by, as I said, 1946, 47, the Civil War hotted up and they were openly fighting each other. Now, as I said before, anyone could tell what was happening, and those who could get away, or get away some of their money, took it out of the country. When people realise that there's economic instability and political instability, what do they do with their assets? They put it somewhere else. So, of course, what were those who were in a position to do? They moved it down here. And 1946, there was a certain amount of company re-registration from Shanghai and Tianjin down to Hong Kong. 1947, quite a bit of capital started to come down. And from 1947 onwards, it was obvious they were rolling down toward the south. So again, you see an external driver of change in here. A thing worth bearing in mind, and here's a nice statistic for you. Between 1947, when the Civil War really started to get hot, until 1952, when the Chinese police state was effectively in control and there were registrations of persons and it was very difficult to get out, about 1,000 people a week, 1,000 a week, came down to Hong Kong as refugees. So you get a population increase from 1 million in 1945, 46, to 2.5 million by 1952. By 1960, the end of the decade I'm going to talk about, there were 3 million people in Hong Kong. So the population trebled. So it's an external driver of many development factors. Now, through 1947 and 48, as the communists moved south, industry went with them and also money went with them. And this is when we started to see the Shanghai people coming down, but I'll talk more about them in a while. It was really these external factors driving this. And then, of course, in the October, we get the proclamation of the People's Government in Peking. It was really, of course, into 1950 that you get the nationalists completely rolled up in the rest of the country. And I mention that because a common date that people use, mistakenly, is 1949. It's really 1950-51 by the time the border areas had actually been completely taken over. But the impact on Hong Kong with this was very profound. The place was full of refugees, and interestingly enough, full of money. And if you've got plenty of refugees and plenty of money, you get plenty of opportunity, because people want to make things quickly, make it. So there's an increase in development opportunity. Now, the refugees. The people that came down then were, in many respects, unique for refugee movements in China at that time. Because typically when there'd been refugees in other times of disturbance, they'd gone from rural areas or city areas into rural areas and gone back. Generally speaking, it was getting away from economic disorder and political disorder, or warfare or famine. But the big difference in 1950 and onwards is that the refugees who came down were politicals. The expectation of the government in Hong Kong was that these people would come, and eventually when things got better in China, they'd go back again. Because historically that's what had happened. In the 1850s with the Taiping Rebellion, people came and then they went. The West River Rebellion, they came and they went. The Boxers, they came and they went. The warlords, they came and they went. The Japanese, they came and they went. So the expectation was come, go, come, go. but it was different in 1950 because the people that came down here were getting away from a political ideology they didn't want, for the most part. And this then meant that they weren't going to go back, even when things recovered, which by 51, 52 they were starting to do. So it was a very interesting thing. You found people who came intending to stay. Now, where did they stay? All of where we are here today, if you look down on the hillsides around and up behind, if we were to look there in 1950, it was like this. And these were the Mukokoi. The thing with the Mukokoi, wood house district, or wood house area, this was the squatter areas. This is where these people lived. Now they came down and they were living in huts made out of timber, sheet steel, asbestos, any sort of rubbish that could be found for people to live in and make some shelter from. And these were all on the hillsides, all of where we are here now. Effectively from here up to the back of Lion Rock and all around eastern Kowloon, it was full of these. And there aren't any there anymore. And that's the thing which must be understood, and I'll explain in a while, because we live overwhelmingly in a success story. The fact that these things are not there anymore is a great success, but I'll come back to that. There's a close-up of what these places were like. Made out of bits of timber and so forth, no running water. The water was usually about 500 metres away from a pipe, and it was kept at a distance. And the policy of government early on was not to make it too comfortable for people. And the reason was, if it's too comfortable, you're going to get more. So you don't want to make it too nice, because if it's too nice, you're going to get more, and the place will be even more overwhelmed. But by the late in 1950, early 51, it was starting to be obvious that these people were not going to go back. And they were also holding up economic development, because these people were on Crown land. So they're on government land in these squatter settlements all over, and you couldn't redevelop it for factories or anywhere to put them in. So if you need to build factories to give them somewhere to work, you need to get them off that place in the first place. And the very beginnings and discussion of squatter resettlement were had at this time. It's interesting, there have been discussions for public housing in Hong Kong in the 1930s. It's not something that came about in 1953, they were talking about it in 1938. So let no one tell you, it was because of the fires, and that's why. The fires were part of it, but not all of it. It had been talked about before. But fires. If you're living in a mukokoi, they're very dangerous, because people are cooking on tan or charcoal, or they're cooking on kerosene, and if any of these things fall over, everything catches fire. And fires were a major problem. Fires could be in two ways. It could be accidental, or it could be on purpose. Because if someone's bought the land and they want to get rid of you, burn you out. And then, of course, what they will do at that time, when things were very corrupt, is they might pay the people in the fire brigade not to come. Because then the fire people come and say, I'm all sorry, there's no water, meaning, nothing to pay, nothing to put it out, you see. There were considerable problems with fires. Big fires in 51 and 52. The major fire which really pushed things was Christmas Day of 1953, and that was in Sekip May, so just around the corner from us. And in Sekip May there was a fire on Christmas afternoon which had more than 50,000 people homeless in one afternoon. So it was cold weather, people were sleeping all over the road, it was an emergency in every way. And actually the British forces had to get involved, and Far East Land forces in Singapore were flying up tents to put people in. That's the thing to remember, because again, don't let anybody tell you that government didn't do anything or the army didn't do anything, because they did. So it's sometimes politically convenient for people to think, the Pakleju, they didn't do anything, blah, blah, blah. It's not the case at all. The army were flying up tents all afternoon from Singapore that day. So just to think, Air Force were. Thing to remember. As I touched on before, these were political refugees, so it became obvious that they weren't going to go back. So many of those that came were educated people. And that actually made these squatter settlements interesting places socially and sociologically, because you had educated people living in them. And it was one of the few times in Chinese history you had poverty and literacy going side by side together. So in these squatter settlements you had teachers, newspaper vendors, journalists, all of that kind of thing, and they had newspaper deliveries and libraries. You wouldn't have expected it, and it's something, again, a fascinating thing, because previously if people were poor, it meant they couldn't read. At this time they were poor and they could read. So it's an interesting sociological shift. The squatter settlements, as I said there before, and this is looking back up to Sijisan, you can see looking in the back there. There you've got these squatter huts. If you look out now, there aren't any. The beginnings of public housing, as I mentioned there before, started with the fires. And it's a thing worth mentioning, public housing today is sometimes pointed up as a government response to poverty. It actually wasn't. It was getting squatters off Crown land. And public housing, or the housing authority is now, originally started out as the resettlement department. So if it's resettlement, it's resettling squatters, taking them from there, putting them somewhere else. But I wanted to mention it because you can see the beginnings of change in this. Now, with the development of public housing, when these squatter settlements were removed, you started to get high-rise development. And high-rise development is quite interesting. You can see the beginnings of them starting off in the distance, over there, and here close up. Now that's very, very interesting because the people that came down to live here overwhelmingly had never lived in a multi-storey building before. If they'd lived in a multi-storey building, it may have been 2 stories or 3 stories, and that's it. They were not living 5, 6, 7 stories up. So that again was a social change. And of course it made life a little bit difficult because people weren't used to it. So if you're from a village, for example, and you had your rubbish in the kitchen, what do? You throw it out the back door, the chicken comes, the pig comes, they eat it, that's that. Clean, gone. But if you're living in the top there and you throw it out the window, down it goes, all dirty and filthy around. So you found through this time there needed to be social hygiene campaigns. And government, of course, started to get involved in this, and through this time you're getting the beginning of public education programs. Some of you might have heard of the thing on Ciudad, and these were quite fun. These were the ladies that were supposed to be responsible for keeping things clean, and people got a prize for having the best area at certain times. So you're starting to see government involvement in people's lives, which you didn't have there before. Now these buildings, the early public housing was called H block, and an H block was because it was in an H. It was a walk-up building, so you had to walk up to the top. The bathing facilities were in the cross of the H. So there was no bathroom, no kitchen. There was a common bathroom, and the kitchen was out on the veranda. But it was better than people had had before because it didn't catch fire. That was the main thing. It was crowded. Everyone was used to being crowded, but it was fireproof. Now the other thing which is interesting here is children. Because the people that came down were generally younger people who could move. So if they're younger people and who could move, they can also have babies. So what starts to happen through the 1950s is you're getting an increase in population. And what happens with an increase in population? Eventually they need to go to school. Government didn't provide much in the way of schooling at that point in time. Until 1971, there was no free primary education. Until 1978, there was no free compulsory secondary. This is interesting today because you've still got people in their 50s who are illiterate because they didn't go to school because they didn't have any chance. But what did happen in many of these resettlement estates, religious groups got involved in setting up schools, and most particularly the political groups got involved. Both the communists and the nationalists built schools. So on the top of these buildings, you can see up there the characters up at the top are for schools, because on the top of these resettlement estates they gave over the space for having a school building. So many of the people who lived in the blocks put their children in the schools at the top. Now many of these schools were very, very closely leftist influenced. And it's quite interesting, depending on the area, you found more leftist influence than not. So if you're in North Point or Saiwan, they had a lot of leftist influence. Sun Tzu Po also had a lot of leftist influence, and they still do. And it's an interesting thing, because they got quite a bit of support, these leftist schools, from some very, very unusual supporters. And one of the people that gave a lot of assistance to them was actually the Anglican Bishop of Hong Kong. But I'll talk more about him in a while. Some really unexpected connections. The Korean War. 1950 saw the outbreak of the war in Korea, and that had a very, very significant effect on Hong Kong politically and economically, because when the Korean War broke out, this is principally fought between China and Korea on one side and the United States and the United Nations on the other. Its impact on Hong Kong was profound, because after the communists had taken power on the mainland, the Americans put an economic embargo, or through the UN, put an economic embargo on China trade. And that made it virtually impossible for the Hong Kong economy to function, because previously things came into Hong Kong and went back out again. So if you can't re-export it, it becomes very difficult. So Korea brought on a very quick and very significant economic change here, from import-export to industrialisation. It also brought about enormous smuggling opportunities, which I'll talk about directly. But the Korean War was fought between 50 and 53, and in that 3-year period, the whole economy in Hong Kong changed very radically. And Korea can be seen, interestingly, as a proxy war, because it was, in many ways, China and the United States fighting each other on a third territory. Very, very fascinating the way it all worked. But Korea is a bigger story than I have here. I show that picture because that's an American warship coming through here in 50-51. But one of the connections with Korea, which links Hong Kong to the broader world, is the 1951 proposal. Now, this is something which, as embryonic journalists, I'm sure you should be interested in, but many don't know anything about it. 1950, there was the embargo on China trade, so almost nothing was going in, nothing was going out. In 1950, the Attlee Labour government in the UK recognised the PRC, and it was the first Western power to diplomatically recognise the People's Republic. Why was that done? It's very interesting. In one way you can see it as being a natural response of a British Labour government to a fellow socialist power. The other was broader economics and broader politics, and it's where Hong Kong is so interesting when you see it as Hong Kong and the world, not just Hong Kong itself. Because, going away from this, in 1948, the communist emergency broke out in Malaya, and that was funded and financed and organised and fought by Chinese communists. Now you think, Malaya, how does that link to Hong Kong? What's the importance of this? Britain at the end of the Second World War was bankrupt. They had no money. They were paying back the cost of the war to the Americans in Lend-Lease. So it all had to be financed in US dollars, and the major supplier of US dollars to Britain was Malaya, from the rubber and the tin. So they needed the money that was coming from there. And Hong Kong was a bargaining chip through much of that time. There were a lot of top-level negotiations taking place with the Malayan government, the British government, the nationalists, the communists latterly, and the Hong Kong government, all about keeping that money running through. And one of the proposals put forward in 1951 was put forward by Sir Alexander Grantham, who was the governor here at that time. And the Grantham proposal, and some of the documents for this are now coming open in public archives, put forward that Hong Kong be returned to China, in the sense that in the middle of the Korean War, by this point in time the economy was completely dead because import-export was gone. It was costing Britain a lot, which they couldn't afford, and the Japanese War had proven that you couldn't defend Hong Kong anyway. So the position there was, it's not much use to us, maybe it's useful as a bargaining chip. And what they were offering at that time was, we'll give you Hong Kong, call off the dogs down in Malaya, stop that down here. And it was very, very close. They very nearly did that, except in 1951, by accident actually, the High Commissioner in Malaya, Sir Henry Gurney, was murdered by the communists, going up for the weekend up to Fraser's Hill. And that changed everything. Combination of the murder of Henry Gurney and the change of government in Britain from the Labour government to the Conservatives changed the broader politics. But I wanted to mention that because was very, very near in 1951 that there wasn't a British Hong Kong anymore. And it's a thing worth understanding because Hong Kong always mattered diplomatically and economically to other places, not to itself. So the Grantham proposal is something which we'll do with some further interesting research. But I wanted to mention it because it was recognised then, as far back as then. We'll get rid of it, it doesn't really matter. We'll use this as a chip when we need to play that game elsewhere. Of course, the nationalist-communist divide was very profound at that time because, of course, the nationalists lost. Chiang Kai-shek went over to Formosa. There you can see Chiang and Mao raising a glass to each other in 1946. You can imagine they probably wish it was poison in each other's cups, but nevertheless, they're cheers like that. The nationalist-communist divide, however, was very profound through this time, and Hong Kong, through the 50s, became a Cold War battleground. You had both of these ideologies fighting against each other in a proxy form here. And there are a number of ways in which this took its role. Hong Kong during this time became strategically quite important as a Cold War observation post because after the Americans had been kicked out from China, this was the only place they could be. So, interesting. 1948, the American consulate here was very small. It did a little bit of visa issuing. That's it. By 1951, it was one of the largest consulates in the world. The USIS, with their information gathering and newspaper translation and so forth, was huge. So it went from being nothing very much to them to being very important. And again, that's where Hong Kong at this time was interesting, because it mattered to the Americans as well. And the Americans were in a position through the 1950s to make it clear to the British, we want you there. Not for you, but for us. So it becomes quite important strategically. The American connections come through at this time too, because the embargo on China trade meant you couldn't take China products into the United States. So anything that was made here had to be stamped up as made in Hong Kong. They had something called certificates of origin. And the C of Es, of course, were a great means of corruption all the way through because you had to pay for various certificates and so on. But anything that was sent had to be certified as made here. So with porcelain, for example, it had to be stated that it was decorated here, not done by dirty communist fingers over on the other side. That was their viewpoint. And it got to silly degrees because even foodstuffs, you had to prove that the ginger, which was exported for sweet ginger, was grown in Hong Kong and not touched by communist fingers. That the dried ducks and so on that were sent over to the Chinatowns in the States were actually made from capitalist ducks, not communist ducks. I mean, it gets really, really funny and silly, but I wanted to mention it because the Americans had a huge economic presence here at that time. But the Cold War battleground played itself out in a couple of ways. 1955 was one of the most tragic, because in 1955 there was the Afro-Asian Conference, and that was the first and, for many, many years, the only conference of non-aligned leaders. This was the leaders of new emerging countries deciding what they would have, and this was held in Bandung, in Java, in 1955. So it was Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, Zhou Enlai of China, being the other, who were meeting there together along with Nkrumah of Ghana and others. Now, Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, was due to travel to Bandung on a chartered Air India plane called the Kashmir Princess, which was going through Hong Kong. And actually their own intelligence agents warned them that actually there was likely to be a bomb planted on the plane. And accordingly, Zhou Enlai didn't travel via Hong Kong, he travelled via Rangoon and Singapore. And interestingly enough, the transit through Rangoon and Singapore was personally guaranteed by Malcolm MacDonald, who was the High Commissioner, British High Commissioner for Southeast Asia. So it was all done at a very, very top level, which indicates that they probably knew what was going to happen with the Kashmir Princess. And I mention that because one of the things I had the fortune to do some years ago was have a detailed interview with Sir Donald Luddington, who was the Defence Secretary at this time, and he was very, very reluctant to talk about it, and I could only think it was probably because they sort of knew and didn't really want to know about it. But what happened? The plane took off from Hong Kong carrying a party of journalists and also one of Zhou Enlai's aides who interestingly enough was a man who'd been at Queen's College, Major Raymond Wong, who had also been with the communist guerrillas during the war. It took off and the plane blew up over North Borneo, or just off Jesselton. Nationalist agents had put a piece of plastic explosive on, about as big as a piece of toothpaste, with a timing device, and when it was coming down over altitude over Jesselton to land and refuel, boom, blew up. There they are, picking up the bits out of the water. Now, the Kashmir Princess was one of these bits of air terrorism which started to really come on through that time, but it really points up one of the interesting things of Hong Kong, and that is it was a place where proxy wars took place. The nationalists and the communists couldn't really fight each other, so they were using Hong Kong and things like this as a battleground. That was one. 1956 was another, and that was the riots. And it's Ola. Hey. Hey. Oh, someone has to earn a living. That's good to know. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you for asking me. See, I was running late. It's my problem. Sorry. In 1956, there were riots in Hong Kong which were, at least in part, communist-nationalist interface. These were, or they really started up around Cheung Sa Wan, and actually at Lei Ching Lung Estate, and it started on this public estate there. One of the things which grew about at that time was, of course, the newspapers were either nationalist funded or communist funded. And if they were nationalist funded, when you bought a nationalist newspaper, you were given a flag, and you were meant to hang it up. And of course, most people would just hang it up and go, yeah, okay, hang it up, and then a few days later they'd take it down. Well, of course, at Double 10th in October, some of these were hung up. The resettlement department said, oh, you should take those down. It became a bit of push, shove, and as always happened at that time, and as always happened with the nationalists, the triad societies became involved. Because it's worth bearing in mind, the nationalists were funded and controlled by the Hak Se Wui. All of them were. You could not be in the nationalists and not be a triad member. It just didn't work. They all were. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was an initiated triad. Yes, it's true, he was. Nobody wants to be reminded of it, but that is actually the fact. So the triads became involved in this, caused up and stirred a great deal of trouble. There were officially about 24 killed. It was actually more like 100 and something. And the damage for this started, as I said, around Sam Sui Po and Cheung Sa Wan and spread up to Chuen Wan and became very bad. The army actually had to be called out. But I mention it because that was one of these proxy conflicts. So 1956, you had the problem with the nationalists and the triads. Subsequently, in the 1960s, you had problems with the communists. And that's another tale and another story. Through this time, Hong Kong started to become more involved in popular culture worldwide. Because until the Chinese Revolution, in the overseas Chinese world, you didn't really look to Hong Kong for inspiration, you looked to Shanghai for inspiration. That was where the films were, it was where the music came from, it was the big city. But after 1949, 1950, people started to look toward Hong Kong in the overseas Chinese world for inspiration, as it still remains. So there were films made here. It became quite exotic, both in a Western sense and in an overseas Chinese sense. So you had films like Love is a Many Splendid Thing, made in the 50s, very, very much a thing of its time. It really did put Hong Kong on an international tourist map, which started to develop then. This, by the way, is a film which I recommend seeing if you get the chance, because if you want to understand times and places, popular culture is a good way to do it. You look at a film from the time, you can see how people lived. This one was set in 1949-50, and the woman that wrote it, this one, she was a doctor at Queen Mary Hospital. Her name was Elizabeth Comber. She was Eurasian, and she ended up subsequently settling down in Malaya. Very interesting woman, and she only died about 9 months ago. Very interesting herself in that she became a great apologist for the communists. She wrote a book about Zhou Enlai and so on. She was the first of the 500 percenters, one of these people who never saw anything wrong with the Cultural Revolution and never saw anything wrong with the mainland at that time, at least in part because she didn't live there and she didn't have to put up with them. She could come and go as she wanted. I'm rather anti her because I met her on a couple of occasions and really didn't like her, but there we are. That's Han Suyin. Yes, of course, Han Suyin, I should have mentioned. Han Suyin was her pen name, by the way. Everyone will have heard of Han Suyin. She had a number of names. Her surname was, before she married was Chow, and then she became Sing Tan, and then she married Leon Comber, so she was Mrs. Comber. Then she married an Indian, so she was quite a friendly lady. There she is in Malaya with her cat. It was probably the only thing that loved her until she died. With a mouth thing about it. Interesting lady, Han Si-yen. Let's get off her. Then there are other films and other books. Hong Kong in popular culture, another one, a very famous one, was The World of Susie Wong. And this was a film and the book set in the 1950s. It really did a lot to spark a tourist industry, certainly among Europeans, because people thought, wow, all these beautiful Chinese women, let's go over here, ha ha ha. So it really, really set off a tourist industry there. But I mention it because through this time in the 50s, Hong Kong started to be seen in the world as a tourist destination, a place of exotica. Through this time, linked into the tourism boom, you couldn't go to the mainland. Or rather, that is to say, you could, but it was very difficult. You needed an invitation. The invitation might take quite a long time to come. You really needed to be one of the socialist partners or socialist friends or so forth. And if you went, it was very carefully controlled. They showed you what they wanted you to see and you didn't see what they didn't want you to see. But if you did come to Hong Kong, you could go up to the border and look. And that was a postcard from Lok Ma Chau looking out. So if you go up to Lok Ma Chau, look out today, that was the time when everyone went and looked down and thought, oh, Red China, over there. Well, of course, what was it? You know, fish ponds and so forth. Now, of course, you go up and it's Sumdung and it's very, very different. But I wanted to mention it because through this time, Hong Kong started to boom internationally as a tourist destination. Through this time as well, the Shanghai people started to have an influence, culturally and economically. Their films, the clothing they wore, of course the cheongsam was very, very much the dress from the north. That was popularised through the 30s and 40s, and of course in the 50s and 60s that's what any educated woman wore. And it was very much a middle-class uniform. I mention this because a dear old friend of our family, Auntie Cecilia, to the end of her life, always wore one of these. Always. I never saw her in anything else. And it's an interesting thing with this because I remember once younger and being a bit foolish saying, Auntie Cissy, you never wear trousers. And she looked me up and down like that and said, but that's what the servants wear. But I don't wear trousers. That's what Fung Te, the Mate, that's the servant. She said that's what Fung Te wears, not what, you know. But I mention that because you get an interesting thing there in terms of cultural marker and in terms of dress and so forth. That was what people wore if they were socially aspiring. Thing just to bear in mind. And of course film posters, hairdress, all that kind of thing was very much influenced by the Shanghai refugee influx. The Shanghai people were of course very involved in industry too. These were people who had capital to invest, and many of them invested it in shipping, so they could get things in and out. They also invested in textiles. And the thing with the textile industry is it was mostly Cantonese weavers, Cantonese spinners, but Shanghainese weavers and dyers. So it was actually a linguistic and regional variation on their economic activity. But they became very, very involved in the textile industry through the 50s, and the textile industry here at that time became a major economic mainstay. So much so that by 1956-57 there had to be a textile quota export arrangement negotiated with the countries which were getting it. The because there was so much Hong Kong cloth going out, and before that there was almost none. Then we get Hong Kong and the overseas Chinese world. As I've mentioned before, until really the 50s, Hong Kong didn't figure much if you're an overseas Chinese person. But from the 50s it did. So if you were in the tin mines in Malaya, or a Chinatown in Los Angeles, or something like that, the films you watched, the dress you wore, the slang you picked up, all of it came through here. And the film industry was a very big part of that. So a lot of people became very familiar with Hong Kong in ways that you would find surprising. People who had never come here, would never come here, knew about the place. And of course, if you go down to modern Malaysia, you still find this, because everyone speaks Cantonese down there. Now, historically, in Kuala Lumpur, in the Kinta Valley, that was Cantonese migrants. But you go to Penang and other places where there are actually Fukien people, they all understand Cantonese. One speak it very well, but they all understand it. And why? Because they watch the TVB television shows and they watch the films. And it's all quite fun. So there was a real movement of Hong Kong popular culture. And you'll find people living in small towns up country in Malaysia who've all heard of Kowloon Tong, they've all heard of Mongkok, they've all heard of Tung Lawang, they've probably never been there, and they may never go, but they've all heard about it. And of course what I find is because I go down there from time to time, sit down in a coffee shop and start talking to people, and of course European male, my age, speaking Cantonese, they assume I'm a policeman. Because that's the only one they've ever seen, because of course it's what you find in the television shows. It's quite good fun. But I just thought I'd mention it because you still get that echo today. They look and think, that's Siam. No. Through this time as well, you got a lot of Southeast Asian Chinese coming up to Hong Kong. And that's something we forget about because we think of the refugees as coming from China. But a lot came from Southeast Asia. And in fact, many of these came from Indonesia. Very large numbers came from Indonesia as the Dutch East Indies melted in the late 40s, because of course what happened with Sukarno's economic policies is they turned against the Dutch, and then eventually Taiwan get against the Chinese as well, and large numbers left. By 1956-57, many of these people were leaving and going up to the mainland, at least in part because many of them, and this is where it gets very interesting, and it's a Hong Kong connection people often don't think about or notice. Through the 1920s and 30s, many of the Indonesian Chinese had been very influenced by national education policies. The nationalist government, the Nanking government, had sent down teachers and sent down textbooks and encouraged people to learn Hokkien. Because in Southeast Asia they all spoke Fukien or Cantonese or Hakka or one of the other languages. Nobody spoke Mandarin because nobody did speak Mandarin. Cantonese was the language of the overseas world. But from the 20s and 30s, the nationalist government tried to encourage these people to think of themselves as Chinese. And why? Because they had money. So if they had money, they'll reinvest it. So they'll think, we're Chinese, we'll put money in there and so on. It's all very thought out. But the thing with this was that by the early 1950s, these were people who had gone through Mandarin education, had thought of themselves as being Chinese. The Indonesian government said, you're Chinese people, and they thought, we're Chinese, so they went to China and realised, of course, when they got there, that they weren't. They were Southeast Asian people. They were used to hot climates and eating spicy food and drinking coffee and having a bath 2 or 3 times a day, not once a week. All of the other things which you weren't used to on the mainland, and they got to China and they couldn't cope with it. They had a real cultural shock because they thought they were something that they were not. And they got there and they couldn't cope with it. They couldn't go back to Southeast Asia, so a lot came to Hong Kong. And there's a lot of Southeast Asian Chinese in Hong Kong today, and in a lot of family stories you find this Indonesian Wagyu background. A lot in North Point, a lot in Causeway Bay, and a lot up around Tsuen Wan and Tsing Yi. Why in those areas? Because any ethnic group will mix where they all are together. So there are people who know themselves, they've got their own businesses, their own clubs and associations and so on. I mention it because these are an ethnic minority which are invisible, because they look the same as everybody else, but they're actually not. And it's quite fun, because if you go in these little Indonesian shops in Hong Kong today, and you listen to the older Chinese people in there, they all speak Hokkien or Dutch or Malay or not very good Mandarin or quite broken Cantonese. Their language background is quite fascinating, but I think it's a thing worth mentioning. There you can see an anti-Chinese demonstration in Indonesia, which of course made more of them come here. Through this time, through the 1960s, the 1950s, there was a lot of infrastructure development, because as more and more people came, you needed to have the things that they needed, and water was the main one. So through the 1950s, there were more and more reservoirs built. Lantau, out at Sekvik, there's a big reservoir there. The other reservoir schemes were built in the 60s, were planned in the 50s, so High Island and Plover Cove and the others. All of this made the new territories very, very vulnerable, and through this time furthered a recognition that you could not actually have a British Hong Kong without the new territories, because it was all linked to water. So through this time there was much more of this infrastructure development, mainly linked into reservoirs and water supplies and roads. That, as I mentioned, was a recognition, as I touched on before, unless you had the new territories, you couldn't keep any of it. So future strategic planning was all linked upon, we keep all of it, or you give all of it away. And that actually goes back to the Grantham proposal I mentioned in 51. They recognised then, couldn't keep it because there's no water, firstly, and secondly, 1941 had proven in less than 3 weeks you couldn't defend it either. So if you can't keep it and you can't defend it, maybe just use it as a time when it's convenient to give it back. I wanted to mention those because they're key issues and themes through this time. Of course, external political circumstances drove further change, and in the late 1950s there was more economic refugee movement down here. The Great Leap Forward, of course, was, as we know today, a good idea, but an economic disaster which caused the country to lose really 10 or 15 years of production and development and so on, and quite tragic, and of course all thanks to this man. But the consequence of that one can see in 1960, 61 and 62, because what happened then, the leap was in 58, the whole economy started to collapse, and then of course they had an enormous man-made famine, and what we ended up with was crossing the border in 1960, 61, 62, for people like these, who you can tell one, look at them, were starving. And this is, of course, one of the consequences one must bear in mind at that time, external forces driving change at that time here. So that's, I guess, what I'd like to conclude on. Hong Kong through the 50s was a time of enormous transformation internally, but completely driven by external circumstances. Southeast Asia, broader conflicts, broader economic and political circumstances, and always, as Han Tzu-Yin wrote in her Many Splendid Thing, which was the novel on which that film was based, always in Hong Kong, China beyond the hills. Thank you for listening to me. Are there any questions? I like questions. Questions are good. If there are no questions, you're not doing your studies properly, sir. What happened during the Japanese invasion? Well, this is again where we look at periods in history. When was the Japanese invasion? That's the thing. Was it 1931 when they came into Manchuria and stole the northeast? Was it 1932 when they came around Shanghai? Was it 1937 when they went up the Yangtze Valley? Or was it 1938 when they captured Canton? I would say that the Japanese came to Hong Kong really in 1938, because they were on the border from that time, and that's when really you see the start toward war. But they actually crossed the border into here at the same time as Pearl Harbor and the landing in North Malaya and the bombings in Southeast Asia, which was December of 41. But really, the whole Japanese war, it was 10 years leading up to it. Yeah. So yeah, long answer to a short question. Long answers are always the way to short questions. Sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, of course, China. I mean, this is the whole thing. One must bear in mind with any study of Hong Kong, and I can never overemphasize this enough, this is part of China, is and always has been. It is not international, it is not cosmopolitan, it never ever has been. Never let anyone tell you international cosmopolitan with Hong Kong. That's BS. I'm too polite to say what BS is, but I'm sure you know. And why is that? 96% of the population are of one racial group, Chinese. Of that 96%, over 80% speak one language as their first or home language, Cantonese. The remaining 4%, 2% are overseas contract workers, these days Filipinos and Indonesians, but if we actually went back historically, 2% of the 4% was a British garrison. The other 2% are anything you can imagine, but it's 2%. So if you've got 96% of the population who are basically one cultural background, you've answered your own question. And that's the thing which is worth bearing in mind with Hong Kong. Always a thing. Why is this society so stable when actually politically it's a joke, it's dysfunctional, it does not work, right? Economically, it's a mess, because of course you've got a very small group of people who control everything. So you look at that and you think politically it's dysfunctional, economically it's got some real problems, but as a society it's very stable, and what generally very stable. Why is that? Because it's monolingual, monoracial, monoethnic. It's not multicultural, it's not multi-ethnic, because if you've got multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial societies, Singapore is a good example, they start to pull each other apart because of racial problems, political issues and so on. So yes, to answer your question, it's always been the Chinese tradition here. And of course, the Chinese tradition, which is always, and I think probably quite a good way, better to talk rather than fight. You see? So you find a way to work it out, you know, chat and organise it. Yes. Yeah. Did that answer that question? But I could not emphasise that enough. Never let anyone tell you this is an international cosmopolitan society, because it is not. Never has been. And if you go back into the 19th century, it's exactly the same. The proportions, ethnically and racially, are about the same. The numbers have increased, but the proportions are the same. So, other questions? You can see why I'm not a good academic. I could never be an academic because I tell the truth.
Thank you very much for your topic. And my question is, can you explain deeper about how the Korean War influenced Hong Kong?
Oh, I thought I did. The main Korean War influence with Hong Kong was that the American embargo or the UN embargo completely squashed off or limited external trade. So previously people would bring in goods and ship it up to China. If you couldn't re-export it, it meant it was just piling up in a warehouse here. So it really changed from import-export to the need to make something here and send it somewhere else. So you get a real drive toward industrialisation then. But one thing I didn't mention, and perhaps should have mentioned at the time of the Korean War, is the great role that Hong Kong played in keeping the country afloat. Why was Hong Kong useful to China at that time? It generated 80% of its foreign exchange. And they needed the foreign exchange to pay for the things that they didn't have, because Chiang Kai-shek and his government had taken all of the gold reserves. So the gold was gone. That was over in Taipei. So they had to have foreign exchange coming in. Hong Kong was very useful for that. It also meant that as it was a free port, you could bring things in and then maybe put them somewhere else. Now, China at that time had no domestic oil industry, they had no pharmaceuticals, there was only oil discovered in 1956, so they had no domestic oil industry, no pharmaceuticals, no major weapons-grade material, no rubber. Now, all of the things that they needed, they had to get from outside. So you could import it into Hong Kong, buy it legally, and then send it somewhere else. So patriotic business people, who had very often been patriotic supporters against the Japanese and had their own smuggling networks at that time, The same network which worked in 1941, 42, 43 would work just as well in 1951, 52, 53. So you had some businessmen who were sending in pharmaceuticals, others were sending in rubber, others were sending in diesel, kerosene and so on. Diesel fuel was a big one because as the fishing industry mechanised in the 1950s, it was a very good source of supply for fuel into China because the fishing boats all had diesel engines and they also had sails. So they'd go out under engines to the fishing areas, turn off the engine, put up the sail, sail over to Macau, pump out the engines, so they've got diesel pumped out there, go back out to the fishing banks, catch the fish, come back to Hong Kong, no fuel. Why is no fuel? Well, they've been out at sea for 3 days, and the oil would then be taken up into China. So it's a thing worth bearing in mind because when we look at the business networks that did very well in the 1980s, these were people who had done what was seen as in the national interest in the 1950s. Now, of course, it's in their own economic interest, but these were the people who were active and involved with that. And the Malaya connection, of course, is very interesting too, because a lot of the business people down there had one hand on one side and another hand on another. It's very interesting when you consider that the people who were investing in China in the 1980s had usually been fairly friendly with at least one side of the communists in the 40s or 50s in Malaya. Of course, there's one big example of this is, of course, that the family that owns the South China Morning Post. Because, of course, the man that owns it, he was on one side of the family, and his brother was a communist bandit and got killed in Malaya in 1951. So you look at that, you think, oh, okay, one side there, the other side there. That's one example. There are many, many others. And, of course, Hong Kong was a useful place for this because they could meet on neutral territory and discuss all of these things together. But no, Hong Kong's big value at that time, strategic materials and currency. Yeah. Another long answer to a short question. Another question. Anything else? Sir?
You had mentioned, of course, that historically Hong Kong has always been this rather homogenous, ethnically, culturally, religiously place.
Not necessarily religiously, because of course you had the missionaries causing trouble. But yeah.
But you had really, during the 1950s, you never really mentioned anything about the British that were here at the time. I mean, were they just such an aloof, reactive entity, although they were in charge of police and courts and politics? Were they just not a part of the 50s in Hong Kong?
Not a part of the 50s for the vast majority of people, because it was really only through the 1950s that you started to get much more government involvement. Historically in Hong Kong, the way things worked was this, and it was a recognition that Hong Kong was always very different to other places. Hong Kong exceptionalism coming in. From the 19th century, there was a recognition you got a very small group of people trying to manage a much larger group of people, and they come from a very old culture and a very old tradition, and they have their own ways of doing things. They're not primitives in Australia or Africa that you can push around. So the whole idea at that point in time was manage it very, very slowly and carefully. So yes, the thing that you found at that time was not very much happening that affected the average person. The average person in the street would never see a European. They would have nearly nothing to do with it. A point I would make, which I found very interesting, was told to me once by an elderly friend who's now dead, was a local writer called Austin Coates. Now Austin was in government here in the late 1940s, and he wrote a couple of quite nice books. One of them was Myself a Mandarin. If you haven't read, I recommend. It's a good story of Hong Kong in the early 50s. But the thing that Austin told me, which I found very illustrative, is that at about 1949-50, he was working in Government House for 3 or 4 months as one of Grantam's private secretaries, mainly put in because Austin was very entertaining and it was sort of keeping Lady Grantham company really in that way. But the point that he made was this, was that every morning Grantham and him and one of the other private secretaries and the detective and a couple of others would go out for a walk around the town just to see what was going on. Now, of course, these days, of course, no one in a senior government position can go anywhere without, of course, the newspapers chasing them and life made a hell. But they went out at that time because no one knew who they were. The average person would never see their photograph. It's just half a dozen fun guy out wandering around on the street. They don't know them, they don't see them. So they were in that sense anonymous. The fact that you could have the governor, the detective and the private secretary out for a walk around in the town, stop for a cup of tea somewhere and go back up to Government House for 9 o'clock to start working on the boxes. You couldn't imagine it today, but they were doing that then. You could still actually do that, interestingly, into the 1980s. And the last one that used to do that regularly was Redwood Ute, because when Teddy Ute was governor here, and of course everyone would remember him as Yao Duck, and of course the thing with Yao Duck was, of course, it's a very nice name for that particular fellow, had perfect Mandarin, perfect Cantonese. He used to go out around private areas and just see what was going on. But he could do that then because there still wasn't that much television, so he could just boom, in, watch, see, and then go back and find out. Quite wonderful, actually, and a big change to go into the 1990s, where you get the disgusting pattern going everywhere, kissing babies and eating dan tart and the rest of it like that. The thing with him is it was all done for publicity. As you go back with Yao Duck, he would actually appear at a market with no warning and talk to the market holder in their own language. What's going on here? What's going on there? Oh, that water pipe's broken. Right, fix it, do it like that. Of course, you've got the government looking after the people. That's what you're after. So yes, going back to it, you could, to answer your question, I think what you found there, a fairly small administrative cadre. It didn't have much to do with the average population. And what I wanted to go through here was broad brush. Yeah. Does that answer that, David? Yeah. Another long answer to a short question. But it's a thing we tend to forget about because, again, with the European society in Hong Kong, it's very small, and generally they all think they're very important and they all know each other. And because they all know each other, everyone thinks that, oh, well, I must be, except, of course, everyone else doesn't know them. And that points up what I mean, you see. You get people who are very, very important in the FCC bar at lunchtime or something and of no other consequence. And Grantham is, of course, a good illustration of that. The governor's out wandering around the town for 2 hours in the morning. No one knows him. Other questions? Sir? Isn't this kind? They've given me something to drink. There's no gin in it, but there we are. The generosity only goes so far. Oh, yeah. Sir?
I think you have explained already about the social issue in Hong Kong, but I just like to know, were there any protests by the Hong Kong people when they tried to transform the city in the 1950s?
No.
And how the Hong Kong government deal with that or
well,
relocation size and things?
The thing is with relocations at that time, this is where it gets interesting. When we look at Hong Kong people, you have to understand something which today people often don't like to be reminded of, and that is, until 1971, the 1971 census, that was the first time historically there were more people who claimed birth in Hong Kong than birth outside of it. So Hong Kong people is really only 40 years old, right? So if we go back into the 1950s, the people there then were all from the mainland. So the idea of saying, oh, we're a Hong Kong person, the people who were really Hong Kong people was a very small group of Chinese, a very small group. The ones who actually had an identity to this place were Portuguese, Eurasians. They were your real Hong Kong people. They were the ones whose families and homes and so on were here, not the majority of the Chinese. So when you talk about transformation and change, today, of course, you get heritage protest movements and people would say, oh, we don't want that change, we don't want this change. Of course, then, if there's a choice between living in a hut and living in a resettlement estate, people say, yeah, when can we move, right? That was very much the view. People really aimed and expected for things to be moving upwards. So no, protest about transformation, people were very happy with it. And actually that's one of the things which is a big change between then and now, because people look now and they think you've had 10 or 15 wasted years. They actually talk about it. When people look and say the energy's gone. Whereas before people said, yes, you can move, you can do this, you can expect things, your children will do different things to you. Whereas now people look and go, no, you can't. From the day you're born, your money goes to their gasing, and that's that, you know. They've got their fingers in your pockets forever. So yes, it's a very different society. And it's why when people look at that time, and there are a lot of popular television serials and so on that point this one up. Below the Line Rock was quite a common one, you see. People look at this and they look at that time, and that's when you find people listening to these songs at that time and they're singing, and why? It's because they look and they think things were better for them, it was better for their children, they thought they could get ahead, and they look now and go, you know. So yeah. So no, you didn't have to deal with protests, people were perfectly happy. And that leads me to something else. The nationalists and the communists, both 56 and in 67, got very little popular support. And why was that? People had come down from the mainland getting away from politics. They didn't want any more of their filthy games. Just keep well away from them. Other questions? Hang on, otherwise I can't hear you. I'm an old man, you see, I can't hear a word.
Thank you. I just wonder if there was any conflict between different refugees in Hong Kong back in the 50s.
Oh yes, well that was what I mentioned before with 1956 and with the nationalists. You had there these different conflicting ideologies would conflict against each other. So of course you had those, yes, naturally.
But they were all from mainland China.
Yes.
But there were still many conflicts.
Of course, because you've got people who were nationalist supporters or communist supporters. They hated each other then, they're going to hate each other in a new place. In the same way, Burma was a good example of that. Northern Burma, you had them fighting against each other there into the 50s. They all hated each other, same thing. Yes.
I just wonder if I thought there was some kind of harmony because they got the chance to flee to Hong Kong and
there was one thing which they used to say. There were 3 flags in Hong Kong. There was the one which went up on the 1st of October, the one that went up on the 10th of October, and then there was the other one which everyone was very grateful for because it hung outside the police station. Yeah. Yes. Ah. Hello.
I'm wondering that, could you please conclude for us that what happened in 1950s in Hong Kong? What's the significance of those transformations in 1950s of this city?
Well, the significance of this, and that's where I would say this is a transformational decade, is when we look at the society we live in today, if we look at things in a reasonable historical context, we want to know why what we live with today is like it is. In the same way, if you look at your own family background, you want to know why you look like you look, because your father looks like you, or your mother looks like your sister, or something like that. So you want to know about where these things came from. So to understand how and why this place is like it is now, how some of the business networks developed, how the economical shifts changed, the development patterns, that's, as I said at the beginning, one of those points where you can see a change. Because if you looked at Hong Kong in the 1930s, it's another place. It's completely another place and very unrecognisable to today. Not only physically, but as a society it's unrecognisable. Whereas the society we have here today, you can trace its origins to that time in a much more comprehensive way. That's, I guess, what I would say.
So if we want to study the Hong Kong society, the modern society, 1950s would be the first step.
It would be a useful starting point. Of course, if you want to know, it's useful to know the earlier aspects of it, but if you really want to know, for example, where the big Chinese business networks that actually make their money today, where people, the Lei Ka-sing and the Sun and Kei people and all of those got their start, you need to study that in the 50s. Likewise with some of the mainland links, when you look at certain families, you think, oh, why are they so friendly? Why have they done so well? You go back to Korean War and the embargo, it starts to make sense. So yeah, if you want to understand now, it's useful to look at them, yes.
Thank you.
Not at all.
Okay, let's do some more data.
Not at all. Wow, a poster, yay, thank you very much.